By the winter of 1944, the skies over the Pacific had changed forever. Japan's once proud air arm, which had ruled from Pearl Harbor to the Philippines, was now shattered and bleeding. The Zero, the elegant white-winged fighter that once symbolized Japanese invincibility, was being burned from the sky by the thousands. And yet, among Japan's remaining pilots, pride still lingered. Even as their cities burned under American firebombs and their fuel reserves vanished, they spoke with reverence of the Zero's agility and grace. To them, no foreign machine could match its harmony of man and metal. That illusion was about to end. Across the Pacific Ocean, inside the roaring assembly halls of Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation in Bethpage, Long Island, American engineers were drawing the last great piston fighter of the war. Its name, F8F Bearcat. It looked nothing like the beautiful, sleek lines of the Zero, or even its American predecessors. It was short, stocky, and brutal in form, a compact barrel of steel wrapped around one of the most powerful engines ever built. When Japanese pilots later saw photos of it, they laughed. A flying oil drum, one sneered. Another, captured after the war, remembered, "We thought America had lost its mind. Such a fat little airplane could never fight." They were wrong, spectacularly wrong. The Bearcat was born in the last desperate months of the war, when the U.S. Navy demanded a fighter that could outclimb, outturn, and outfight anything left in Japan's arsenal. The F6F Hellcat had already swept the Pacific clean of Japanese air power, boasting an astonishing kill ratio of 19-1. But Grumman's engineers, led by Robert Hall and test pilot Corky Meyer, wanted something even more extreme. They studied every lesson the war had taught them, that speed could mean survival, that climb rate was life, and that agility often mattered more than raw firepower. The Bearcat would embody all three. It was designed around a single monstrous heart, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, a twin-row, 18-cylinder engine capable of 2,100 horsepower. To harness its fury, Grumman stripped away every ounce of unnecessary weight. The Bearcat was 20% lighter than the Hellcat and nearly 2 feet shorter. Its wings were clipped for faster roll rate. Its fuselage was shortened to the bare minimum. The result was a plane that seemed almost comically small compared to its engine, which made up nearly half the aircraft's total length. Yet when engineers first ran the throttle to full power, the hangar shook. One mechanic later joked, "It looked like the engine grew wings and decided to fly." By early 1945, prototypes were already roaring down the runways at Grumman's test field. Pilots reported acceleration so fierce that it pinned them to their seats. From takeoff to 10,000 feet in less than 100 seconds, something no piston aircraft had ever done. "It climbs like a homesick angel," Corky Meyer grinned after his first flight. Word spread quickly through Navy circles. Grumman had built a monster. But Japan didn't know. Thousands of miles away, its surviving pilots were still being trained on outdated aircraft, the aging Zero, the K-43 Oscar, and the K-84 Frank. They believed, wrongly, that America had reached the limits of piston engine performance. Intelligence reports from captured U.S. documents spoke vaguely of a new Grumman fighter, but the photos that filtered through, stubby, rounded, with a disproportionately large propeller, made them laugh. "A joke," one pilot told his superior. "The Americans have built a barrel to chase ghosts." What they didn't understand was that the Bearcat represented the final evolution of the propeller age, the ultimate piston fighter. Every curve, every rivet, every inch of its design had one purpose: to win vertical combat. Its massive propeller, over 12 feet in diameter, could bite the air harder than any rival. Its wings, short but perfectly balanced, gave it unmatched roll response. Its power-to-weight ratio was so extreme that it could go from idle to takeoff speed in less than 10 seconds. Had the war lasted another month, Japan's mocking laughter would have died in fire and disbelief. In April 1945, as American carriers swarmed the Pacific like floating fortresses, the first squadrons of Bearcats began training on board the USS Langley and USS Bennington. Navy instructors were stunned. Compared to the Hellcat, the Bearcat could take off from half the distance, turn tighter, and reach 10,000 feet before a Hellcat had even cleared 6,000. "It's not an airplane, it's a missile you can land," one said. And yet, for all its promise, fate was cruel. While the Bearcat's wings were flexing under the bright spring sky of 1945, Tokyo was burning. Hiroshima and Nagasaki would soon follow. The war was ending, and the Bearcat would never have the chance to face the enemy it had been built to destroy. Still, its story, and the laughter that greeted it, revealed something deeper about the closing months of World War II. Japan still believed it understood air combat. America had already moved beyond it. The Bearcat was not just a new fighter, it was the physical embodiment of industrial evolution, proof that by the end of the war, the United States could build machines so far beyond its enemy's comprehension that they looked absurd until they flew. By the summer of 1945, as Japan's empire crumbled and its proud pilots awaited orders that would never come, the steady silhouette of the flying barrel was already taking to the skies above the Pacific, a warning that the age of the Zero was over, and that something far faster, stronger, and deadlier had arrived. The story of the F8F Bearcat began not in the chaos of battle, but in the cool, calculated minds of engineers who had already conquered the sky once before. By 1943, Grumman's F6F Hellcat was the undisputed king of the Pacific. It had shredded Japan's vaunted Zero squadrons, restored the balance of air power, and turned American carrier decks into unstoppable floating airfields. The Hellcat was powerful, reliable, and deadly, but it was also big, heavy, and increasingly challenged by the next generation of enemy fighters that intelligence officers whispered about. Faster Zeros, new Nakajima designs, and interceptors like the K-84 Frank that could outclimb even the Hellcat under certain conditions. The U.S. Navy knew it needed something radical, a successor that could dominate the post-Hellcat era. In mid-1943, the Bureau of Aeronautics sent out a request to Grumman: build a fighter that climbs faster than anything on Earth. The directive was simple but brutal. The new aircraft had to take off from small escort carriers, reach combat altitude in minutes, and match or surpass the performance of the best land-based interceptors. It had to combine the ruggedness of a Grumman with the agility of a racer. Grumman's chief engineer, Robert L. Hall, and test pilot Corky Meyer began sketching designs on drafting tables still stained with Hellcat blueprints. "We had the best fighter in the world," Hall later said, "but we knew we could do better. The next one had to be pure instinct and horsepower." Leroy Grumman himself, the company's founder, reportedly told his team, "Build the smallest airframe you can around the biggest engine we can get, and make it climb like the devil." That engine was already legendary, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder twin-row radial that powered not only the Hellcat, but also the F4U Corsair, P-47 Thunderbolt, and B-26 Marauder. It produced over 2,100 horsepower in combat trim, more than enough to tear a lesser aircraft apart. But Hall's team wasn't content to simply reuse it. They would refine it, made it to a propeller of massive diameter, and wrap the entire machine around the power plant like a bullet casing around a slug. To achieve unprecedented climb and acceleration, weight reduction became an obsession. Every ounce counted. Armor was minimized, the fuselage was shortened by nearly 2 feet compared to the Hellcat. The landing gear was made retractable into short, wide stances for rapid deck launches. Even the cockpit canopy was simplified for aerodynamic purity. The resulting mock-up looked, frankly, strange, a stubby, compact creature with a huge nose and tiny wings. When the Navy's first observers saw it in 1943, one officer scoffed, "It looks like a bulldog that swallowed a hornet." But when engineers ran the first wind tunnel tests, the laughter stopped. The Bearcat's aerodynamics were extraordinary. Despite its size, it generated lift efficiently at low speeds and could roll faster than any fighter of its class. At 8,500 pounds empty, it was astonishingly light, nearly 2,000 pounds less than the Hellcat. With a top speed projected above 420 miles per hour and a climb rate over 4,500 feet per minute, it promised to be the most agile carrier fighter ever built. The team nicknamed it the Pocket Rocket. In August 1943, the prototype F8F was completed and readied for flight at Bethpage, Long Island. The test pilot, Bob Hall himself, climbed into the cockpit on the morning of August 21st. The mechanic stood back as the R-2800 roared to life, its twin rows of pistons churning the air into a living thing. The little aircraft shook violently, the propeller a silver blur. Then it leapt forward down the runway and lifted off before anyone realized it was airborne. Witnesses swore it was the fastest takeoff they'd ever seen. Hall climbed to 10,000 feet in barely over a minute and a half, a figure that seemed impossible at the time. It was like flying a thunderbolt, he later said. The airplane just wanted to go up. The flight lasted barely 25 minutes, but when Hall landed, his grin said everything. The Navy had its fighter. Production began almost immediately. The Bearcat's design was further refined for carrier use, folding wingtips, arresting hooks, and reinforced gear. Engineers also adjusted the center of gravity to prevent stalls at low speed, a necessity for deck landings. Despite these changes, the aircraft remained incredibly light. The Navy's Bureau of Aeronautics formally approved it for mass production in February 1944, one of the fastest development cycles in aviation history. At the same time, intelligence reports from the Pacific confirmed what Grumman already suspected. Japan Zero was obsolete. The A6M5, the latest variant, could barely reach 360 miles per hour and lacked the armor and firepower to challenge new American fighters. Yet, Japan was rumored to be developing its own next-generation aircraft, high-altitude interceptors and suicide fighters designed to defend the homeland. The Bearcat's mission became clear. It would be the weapon of the final push, the air shield of the invasion of Japan. Grumman's engineers worked day and night. Factory lines that had once built Hellcats were now filled with rows of compact Bearcats, their navy blue fuselages gleaming under factory lights. Pilots arriving from the front lines marveled at them. It looked like a Hellcat that had been hit by a shrink ray, one quipped. Another said, "She's all engine and attitude." But while its creation was a triumph of engineering, its timing was cruel. By the time the first Bearcats rolled off the line in the spring of 1945, the war was already drawing to a close. Still, for the men who built it, the Bearcat represented something larger, a promise that even as the world's greatest conflict neared its end, American innovation was still climbing. In an age where nations were racing toward the jet engine, the F8F Bearcat was the last and greatest roar of the piston era, a machine that defied gravity not through technology alone, but through pure, unrestrained willpower. The Navy had asked for a fighter that could reach the sky faster than anything alive. The engineers at Grumman delivered one that could almost touch it. When the first production F8F Bearcats rolled out of Grumman's Bethpage factory in early 1945, the Navy's test squadrons could hardly believe what they saw. The aircraft seemed too small, too dense, too overpowered to make sense. The propeller alone looked like it belonged to a bomber. But as flight testing began in earnest, it became clear that this flying barrel was unlike anything that had ever graced a carrier deck. The U.S. Navy's Flight Test Division at Patuxent River, Maryland, received the first batch of aircraft in February 1945. Among the pilots assigned to evaluate the Bearcat was Lieutenant Commander John "Jack" Thomas, a veteran of Pacific dogfights who had flown both the Hellcat and the Corsair. When he first climbed into the cockpit, he noticed how different it felt. The view over the nose was excellent, the controls simple and clean, but the fuselage felt unnaturally short, almost cramped. "You sit on top of the engine," he wrote in his notes. "Feels like you're flying a propeller with wings." The mechanics fueled it, the chocks were pulled, and Thomas pushed the throttle forward. The double wasp roared like an unleashed animal.
The plane accelerated so fast that he barely had time to react before the tail lifted. The Bearcat leapt off the runway at barely 85 knots. It took off like it was escaping something, he laughed afterward. The climb was nearly vertical. The altimeter spun like a clock hand gone mad. Within 90 seconds, the aircraft had reached 10,000 feet. No fighter in history had ever done that before. The reports from the test pilots were ecstatic and a little terrified. The Bearcat's rate of climb, roll speed, and acceleration were unmatched, but its compact frame made it twitchy at low speeds. The short wings meant that if a pilot lost control on landing, recovery was almost impossible. The massive propeller created torque that could flip the airplane if handled carelessly. It was a thoroughbred, not a workhorse, and like all high-performance machines, it demanded respect. Still, the Navy was willing to take the risk. Carrier combat in the Pacific had taught them that climb rate and agility were survival itself. A fighter that could get above its opponent faster would win the first and often the only chance to strike. And in that regard, the Bearcat was a dream come true. It was everything the Hellcat wasn't: smaller, quicker, more aggressive. But Grumman's engineers faced problems that nearly derailed production. The Bearcat's enormous propeller required a longer landing gear to prevent it from striking the deck during takeoff and landing. That in turn created instability. The gear was narrow and tall, making deck operations tricky. Early test flights saw multiple accidents where pilots bounced or porpoised off carrier decks. One prototype flipped completely on landing aboard the USS Charger, its landing gear snapping like matchsticks. The pilot walked away, but the incident forced Grumman to reinforce the gear struts and adjust the wing angle by 2 degrees. It worked. Meanwhile, Navy test groups continued to push the limits. The Bearcat's top speed, 421 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, was impressive, but it was its acceleration that stunned everyone. In simulated dogfights, it could outclimb and outturn the Hellcat by a wide margin. Against the P-51 Mustang, the Bearcat could gain altitude twice as fast and pull tighter turns at low speed. If this thing had come out a year earlier, one pilot said, the Japanese wouldn't have lasted another month. By mid-1945, the Bearcat's test results were complete. It could take off from short escort carriers, climb at over 4,500 feet per minute, and carry a devastating loadout: 4 12.7mm Browning M2 machine guns, 2 1,000-pound bombs, or rockets under the wings. In simulated strike missions, it proved capable of intercepting and destroying high-altitude bombers like the B-29, the very weapon the Japanese feared most. The Navy began forming its first operational squadrons around the new fighter: VF-19, VF-20, and VF-18. Pilots trained aboard the USS Langley and USS Bennington, practicing rapid launches and climbs to intercept simulated enemy bombers. The Bearcat could be airborne and at combat altitude before the second Hellcat even left the deck. Watching from below, carrier crews often cheered as the compact blue fighters clawed into the sky like rockets. They looked like they were chasing the sun, one sailor recalled. But with triumph came tragedy. The Bearcat's performance pushed its pilots and their aircraft to the limit. During one high-speed dive test, a pilot exceeded the aircraft's redline speed and suffered catastrophic control loss. The airframe held, but the tail nearly tore off. Engineers quickly strengthened the horizontal stabilizers, adding thicker skinning and reinforced bolts. These rapid modifications became a hallmark of Grumman design philosophy: adaptability under pressure. Even as the aircraft matured, time was running out. Japan's resistance was collapsing. The U.S. Navy had already captured the Marianas and Iwo Jima, and American B-29s were reducing Japan's cities to ashes. The invasion of the home islands, codenamed Operation Downfall, loomed, and the Bearcat was intended to play a leading role in that massive operation. But fate intervened. On August 6th, the Enola Gay dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki followed. The war that had birthed the Bearcat ended before it could ever take flight in combat. For the engineers and pilots who had poured their souls into it, the victory was bittersweet. We built the ultimate piston fighter, and the war ended 1 week too soon. The Bearcat would never duel with the Zero, never face the Ki-84, never prove its worth in the chaos of battle. Instead, it became the silent testament to what might have been, a weapon ready for a sky that no longer needed defending. Yet in that silence, the Bearcat's legend began to grow. It was the proof of America's industrial dominance, that even in victory, the nation was still building faster, stronger, and smarter machines than any enemy could imagine. As 1945 came to a close, the first operational squadrons of Bearcats stood ready on their carrier decks, wings folded under the Pacific sun. The war was over, but the flying barrel waited, engines quiet, claws sheathed, for a battle that would never come. In a world turning toward the jet age, it was both the end of one era and the beginning of another.
By the time the first F8F Bearcats were fully combat ready, the world they had been built for had vanished. Japan had surrendered in August 1945. The carriers that once bristled with Hellcats and Corsairs were now bringing troops home, not launching fighters into battle. For the pilots who had trained to fly to Bearcat, it was a strange, hollow triumph. Victory had come, but their weapon had arrived too late to use. Still, the U.S. Navy wasn't about to discard what was arguably the finest piston-engine fighter ever built. In the months after VJ Day, squadrons of freshly minted Bearcats took to the air, not to fight, but to perfect the art of flight itself. These were the last days of propeller dominance, and the Bearcat became their final glorious expression. At Naval Air Station Jacksonville, Florida, and aboard the carriers Langley, Bennington, and Boxer, pilots pushed the new aircraft to its limits. Many of them were combat veterans from the Hellcat and Corsair eras. To them, the Bearcat was a revelation. It leapt into the air like a thrown knife, responded instantly to every control, and climbed with a ferocity that no previous Navy plane could match. The Bearcat didn't fly, one pilot recalled years later, it just teleported upward. In simulated engagements, Bearcats easily outmaneuvered every piston fighter in service, American, British, or otherwise. Against a Corsair, the Bearcat could outturn it at any altitude. Against a P-51 Mustang, it could climb nearly twice as fast. Against a famed Spitfire Mark 14, it could roll faster and dive harder. It was the perfect predator, the physical limit of what a propeller-driven aircraft could achieve. And yet, it would never fire a shot in anger. The Navy's focus was already shifting. The jet age had arrived. The Lockheed PAE Shooting Star and the Navy's own McDonnell FH-1 Phantom were in prototype stages. The first jet aircraft had already proven capable of speeds over 500 miles per hour, well beyond the Bearcat's reach. Though the Bearcat was arguably superior in maneuverability and climb below 20,000 feet, its piston engine could not match the sheer velocity of the new generation. Still, the U.S. Navy wasn't about to discard what was arguably the finest piston fighter ever built. In the months after VJ Day, squadrons of freshly minted Bearcats took to the air, not to fight, but to perfect the art of flight itself. These were the last days of propeller dominance, and the Bearcat became their final glorious expression. At Naval Air Station Jacksonville, Florida, and aboard the carriers Langley, Bennington, and Boxer, pilots pushed the new aircraft to its limits. Many of them were combat veterans from the Hellcat and Corsair eras. To them, the Bearcat was a revelation. It leapt into the air like a thrown knife, responded instantly to every control, and climbed with a ferocity that no previous Navy plane could match. The Bearcat didn't fly, one pilot recalled years later, it just teleported upward. In simulated engagements, Bearcats easily outmaneuvered every piston fighter in service, American, British, or otherwise. Against a Corsair, the Bearcat could outturn it at any altitude. Against a P-51 Mustang, it could climb nearly twice as fast. Against the famed Spitfire Mark 14, it could roll faster and dive harder. It was the perfect predator, the physical limit of what a propeller-driven aircraft could achieve. And yet, it would never fire a shot in anger. The Navy's focus was already shifting. The jet age had arrived. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star and the Navy's own McDonnell FH-1 Phantom were in prototype stages. The first jet aircraft had already proven capable of speeds over 500 miles per hour, well beyond the Bearcat's reach. Though the Bearcat was arguably superior in maneuverability and climb below 20,000 feet, its piston engine could not match the sheer velocity of the new generation. Still, in the years immediately following the war, the Bearcat found a different purpose. It became the perfect transitional aircraft, the bridge between the World War II era and the dawn of jet aviation. Young Navy pilots fresh out of training learned their trade in Bearcats before moving on to early jets. It was forgiving enough to teach, yet fierce enough to humble. A careless throttle push or a rough landing could still destroy it. Pilots respected it as both teacher and executioner. It was also during this period that the Bearcat's aesthetic, once mocked as awkward, began to inspire awe. Its compact fuselage and massive propeller, its deep navy blue paint glinting under the sun, became symbols of American power and engineering mastery. For those who had grown up under the roar of the Hellcat, the Bearcat looked like evolution incarnate, faster, smaller, angrier. In 1946, the Bearcat entered limited production for several Navy and Marine Corps squadrons. The F8F1 and the later F8F2 variants carried improvements in firepower and range. Some were adapted for reconnaissance, others for ground attack. But even as they trained and performed, the writing was on the wall. Jets were taking over. The Navy's first operational jet fighter, the FJ-1 Fury, was already making carrier landings. Still, the Bearcat refused to go quietly. In 1947, it made history in a different way, as a record breaker. On August 16, 1946, test pilot Commander R.M. Andy McGrose set the new world climb record in an F8F1, reaching 10,000 feet in just 94 seconds, the same number that had been whispered in Grumman hangars years earlier. No piston aircraft in history had ever done better. As peacetime settled over America, Bearcats began appearing in air shows, thrilling crowds with their impossible climbs and vertical rolls. "It looked like it was climbing on a string," one spectator said. The aircraft became a living embodiment of power, a reminder that even without war, engineering could inspire awe. But elsewhere in the world, the Bearcat found one last chapter in combat. The French Navy, rebuilding after the war, purchased dozens of surplus F-8Fs from the U.S. and deployed them in Indochina during the late 1940s and early 1950s. There, in the jungles of Vietnam and Laos, the Bearcat finally met battle. It strafed convoys, bombed river crossings, and provided air support for French troops fighting the Viet Minh. Pilots admired its reliability in harsh conditions, its ability to take damage and still bring them home. "She was the best piston fighter I ever flew," one French ace said. "She didn't care about weather, she didn't care about altitude, she just climbed and killed." Ironically, the Bearcat, designed to fight Japanese pilots in 1945, ended up fighting Asian ground forces in the 1950s. Its speed, ruggedness, and low-altitude agility made it deadly in that unforgiving environment. Back in the United States, the Bearcat's reputation evolved from warplane to legend. Its pilots called it the last gunfighter, the final piston-powered guardian of the skies. Aviation historians began to see it for what it was, not just another fighter, but the pinnacle of an era that would never return. Grumman's designers, too, saw the Bearcat as both triumph and farewell. Robert Hall once reflected, "We built her for war, but she was born into peace. Maybe that's how all great machines should end. Ready, but never needed." By 1949, the Bearcat's frontline service with the U.S. Navy had come to an end. The jets had arrived for good. The F9F Panther and F2H Banshee were taking their place on carrier decks, and the Bearcats were relegated to reserve squadrons, training commands, and air races. Yet when historians looked back at the closing years of World War II, they saw the Bearcat as more than a footnote. It represented something powerful, the sheer industrial force of the United States at its wartime peak. Even as victory approached, America was still inventing, still building, still reaching higher. Had the war continued just a few more months, Japan's final aerial defenders, desperate, undertrained boys in aging Zeros, would have faced the Bearcat. The outcome was inevitable. The flying barrel they once mocked would have torn through their formations with terrifying ease. But perhaps history showed mercy. The Bearcat never had to prove its dominance in blood. It proved it in flight.
When the 1950s dawned, the age of jet propulsion was in full stride. Sleek metal birds like the F9F Panther, F-86 Sabre, and MiG-15 screamed through the skies,
leaving propellers and pistons behind like relics of a slower world. And yet, among veterans, test pilots, and engineers, there was a quiet reverence, a lingering affection for one last machine that had defined the peak of piston flight, the Grumman F8F Bearcat. The Bearcat was in many ways a paradox. It had been born at the height of war, but had arrived too late to fight. It represented the culmination of everything engineers had learned over a decade of aerial combat, yet it was rendered obsolete instantly by the arrival of jet engines. But time would prove that its significance went beyond combat. The Bearcat was not just another fighter. It was the moment aviation engineering reached perfection with the tools of the old world, before the leap into the new. In the post-war years, while most prop-driven fighters were retired or scrapped, the Bearcat found a second life. The Navy used it as a transitional aircraft to train the first generation of jet pilots, teaching them the discipline of energy management and throttle control that no jet could forgive. If you could master the Bearcat, said one instructor, you could handle anything with wings. Its reliability and agility also made it a favorite for air racing, a stage where it would prove its prowess beyond any battlefield. In the late 1950s and through the 1960s, surplus Bearcats dominated the Reno air races. Pilots like Darrell Greenemeier took the stock F8F and transformed it into a legend. Greenemeier's Conquest 1, a highly modified Bearcat, set a world speed record for piston aircraft in 1969, 528.33 miles per hour. That record stood unchallenged for nearly 3 decades. The Bearcat was born to go fast, Greenemeier said. It just never got the chance to show it during the war. In France, the Bearcat became one of the few piston fighters to serve in post-war combat. Between 1951 and 1954, the French Navy flew F-8Fs during the First Indochina War. Over the steaming jungles of Vietnam and Laos, Bearcats launched from rough airstrips and aircraft carriers, striking Viet Minh positions with bombs, rockets, and machine guns. Pilots praised its ruggedness and speed, often flying multiple sorties a day. Though outclassed by emerging jet aircraft, the Bearcat proved invaluable in low-level close support missions, the role it had been destined for in Japan but never fought. Back home in America, however, its story turned from operational to symbolic. The Bearcat became a staple of air shows, its thunderous radial engine and compact, muscular silhouette captivating crowds who had grown up during the war. Its deep navy blue paint and White Star insignia became icons of the 1940s, a reminder of a time when machines were built by hand, pilots relied on instinct, and the sky still belonged to propellers. To engineers and historians, the Bearcat's technical achievements remained astonishing. It had a power-to-weight ratio greater than 1:1 when lightly loaded, something unheard of for a piston aircraft. It could outclimb any fighter of its time, and its handling characteristics, fast roll, stable pitch, and razor-sharp control became benchmarks for future design. Grumman engineers would later admit that many lessons from the Bearcat's aerodynamics directly influenced the company's jet fighters, including the F9F Panther and the later F-14 Tomcat. But beyond its blueprints and records, the Bearcat's true legacy was psychological. It represented a turning point, the moment America's industrial power and aviation science had outpaced its enemies beyond recognition. When Japan's remaining pilots had laughed at the flying barrel, they had done so from a position of desperation, clinging to the myths of the Zero superiority. They could not have known that the Bearcat, stubby and inelegant, embodied the evolution of war itself, faster, tougher, smarter, and utterly merciless. Had the war continued into late 1945, the Bearcat would have been the instrument of Japan's final humiliation. In Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of the home islands, Bearcat squadrons were slated to escort B-29s and strafe Japanese airfields, intercept kamikazes before they reached the fleet, and dominate the skies over Kyushu. Against the frail and desperate Zeros of 1945, the Bearcat's climb, armor, and firepower would have been overwhelming. But fate, and 2 atomic bombs,
ensured that confrontation would never occur. Perhaps that was for the best. The Bearcat's destiny was not to kill, but to symbolize the end of killing, the final expression of what human hands could create before the machines became faster than their masters. Today, only a handful of Bearcats still fly, fewer than 20 worldwide. Each time one takes off at an air show, its radial engine growling like distant thunder, the crowd looks up and witnesses something that feels impossible, the physical embodiment of speed, power, and elegance from another time. Its takeoff roll is short, its climb near vertical. Within seconds, it is a dark blue streak against the sky, as if the past itself refuses to stay on the ground. In museums across the United States, from the Smithsonian's Udvar Hazy Center to the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, the Bearcat stands beside its older siblings, the Hellcat and the Wildcat. Together, they tell a story of evolution, from underdog to dominator, from necessity to perfection. The placard beneath the Bearcat usually says something simple like, "Last piston engine fighter built by Grumman," but that line barely scratches the truth. The Bearcat was more than the last of its kind. It was the proof that human ingenuity could turn even a flying barrel into a masterpiece of speed and grace. For the pilots who once trained in them, the Bearcat remains unforgettable. Retired Commander Corky Meyer, Grumman's chief test pilot, described it best in his memoirs. Quote, "When you opened the throttle, it didn't climb, it lunged for the heavens. It made you feel invincible, and maybe for those 90 seconds, you were." End quote. That, in the end, is the legacy of the F8F Bearcat. Not a weapon that won a war, but a machine that defined the pinnacle of what propeller-driven flight could be. The fighter that never needed to prove itself in battle, because its very existence proved everything. The triumph of design, the arrogance of mockery, and the endless reach of human ambition. The flying barrel that Japan once mocked became the final roar of the piston age. The sound of the sky itself, evolving.